Well, I think I'll do. I think it's best just to kind of talk through the passage.
Uh-huh.
That sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. All right. So Matthew 24. I'm sure the headers of your Bible would say something along the lines of destruction of the temple predicted. Right. So now again, this is where futurists become preterists. They recognize that he was speaking of a temple coming down. Okay. But I think the argument that I make is that the futurists start with us. They start with preterists, and as the text goes on, they start moving away from that context because they start making everything future. Why? Because I think they don't take Jesus at his words. So we'll just kind of start off here. So on the following going into chapter 24, and again we insert chapters. We do that. So there is no real break. The previous chapter, though, we read about Jesus giving the woes to the Pharisees, basically bringing judgments, saying judgments to come for you. Because why? They pretty much anybody that came to speak the truth, they killed, right? They murdered, right? So from the blood of Abel, right, to the blood of Zechariah, right? They talk about how God sent prophets to point them to the truth, and when they should have received this prophet, the Son, right, the Son of God, the Messiah, they've rejected him. So he's saying to them that all these things will come on this generation. And he's speaking about judgment to come for them. So then that's in verse 36 of chapter 23. And then now he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her? How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks and under her wings, but you were not willing. Right? So there's that picture of God having come to his people, right? He's putting his arms out to his people, but they were not willing. So what does he say? He says, see, your house is left to you desolate. Desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then they leave. So Jesus and his disciples, they leave out from the temple, and and the disciples, as they go out, they point to the buildings, how great these buildings are. Look how magnificent it is, right? And what does he says? He says, truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. So he's predicting the destruction of the temple. So in verse 3, the disciples kind of ask a couple questions. They say, tell us when these things will happen, and what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, this is where a futurist will say that this coming is a visual coming that hasn't happened yet. Now, there will be a visual, physical coming, but that hasn't happened yet. But really, what Jesus talks to, he tells them of what to be looking for. Because he says elsewhere that when this ultimate end comes, nobody knows the day or the hour, right? Not even the Son of Man knows. So the question is, if nobody knows, then nobody knows what to look for. Then how can we then take that passage and say that it's going to be a physical coming at a certain time? We don't know. But in this section, he gives them things to look for, right? So the thing is, we're as Christians, we're told to be ready, be ready. You don't know. But yet in this section from 24 1 up through 33, he tells them all these things to be looking for. So there's definitely a different way of approaching the text that is being bypassed. So a famous section he goes into, he starts talking about what's going to come. He says these things must take place. He talks about here's of wars, rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. But what's funny is a lot of people, I heard this the other day in church, I forgot who was, mentioned wars and rumors of wars as being the signs of the end. Well, he says those aren't the things. Don't look for those. Because we naturally think, wow, we see all this mayhem around us. There's destruction coming. So there must be the end coming. He says, no, those things are going to happen. Right? So that's where a lot of people, and I'm going to insert this here about postmillennialism, said that the 20th century brought an end to a postmillennial perspective because they thought the world isn't getting better and better and better. How can you... Obviously, a postmillennial view says it's the view of hope that the world will continue to grow in its Christian faith. But all these wars and all this destruction seem to, in a sense, contradict that. So that became used to invalidate postmillennial perspective. But the thing is, we can't use newspapers. We can't use the news footage to derive theology, right? If that was the case, I mean, if we use that, then there's all kinds of things in the Bible that we'd be like doubting were to happen, but God brought it to fruition. And let's just go back to Genesis. Think about when he promised Abraham a son. How old was he when he had a son? He was good as dead, the Bible says, right? But God brought him his son. His wife laughed at him, thinking, there's no way God could do this. Right? So if they just looked at the natural things around them, then their own lives of being so old, thinking there's no way it could happen, what did he do? He brought them a child, the child of promise. So we can't look at the signs around us and look at how maybe how the moral fabric of society is completely breaking down and say, oh, the post millennial's out. There's no hope of anything good. Well, the problem is, again, we have to look at the scriptures. What do the scriptures talk about? So getting back to that, Jesus talks about kingdoms and nations rising up against each other. Right? There'll be famines, earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of labor pains. But again, this doesn't mean the end's here yet. We got to keep that in mind. And then he says to them about persecutions being predicted. He says, they will hand you over to be persecuted. They will kill you. You'll be hated by all nations because of my name. Now, here's another thing. We think of nations now as being these type of continents, large superpowered countries. But honestly, nations were always kind of very small little pockets all around that area. So when he's talking about nations, there's literally like 120 nations within that area around them that was under Roman territory. Roman owned that. Roman was the empire over that, but there's all these nations. So we got to, again, we're not inserting our understanding of nations from a modern context into a New Testament context. And he says, the many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will multiply, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. There's that passage, the one who endures to the end will be saved. We take that as a eternal passage of promise that if we endure to the end of our lives, in Christ we'll be saved. Now that is true. That's an absolute true statement. It isn't about enduring the race, right? Moving on towards the upward call of Christ that Paul talks about. So there is that for the individual, but again, he's talking about a certain time. Right? This is context specific to what's going on here. He's answering their questions about what's to come. And then as far as the end comes, right? As far as he talks about many being deceived and he endures to the end. What is that end? Well, he gives the end towards the end of the Olivet Discourse. But he says the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Now, this passage is like a clincher for futurists, right? Because why? We think, well, the good news of the kingdom has not been proclaimed in all the world yet as a testimony to the nations. So obviously that hasn't happened. So there can't be an end yet. So therefore, if I, as a preterist, see that being in the first century, I sound kind of foolish if I think the gospel has gone to every nation in the world. Well, again, we're talking about a context. Now, one thing that's important to know, the word translated as world is not the word cosmos or Gaia, which refers to like this globe. It's oikomene, which refers to an actual localized area of the inhabited world around them. And it's the only time that Matthew uses this term. Other times when he speaks about world, he does use the term cosmos or Gaia. So there's a specific context that he's speaking to. And he says here, the good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed. Okay, as a testimony to the nations. So it's testifying to the good news of the kingdom. And what is that good news? That the kingdom is here, that Christ has brought this kingdom. So it's a testament to the nations, the Messiah has come, right? And then the end will come. What is this end again? Do you want me to keep going? Do you want to pause at some point?
No,
just go through the whole thing? Okay.
You're going really good.
Perfect, okay. He says, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. It's a little in parentheses. He wants the reader to understand he's referring to something. Referring to that what Daniel is talking about, right? He says, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. So, before I get ahead of myself, the abomination of desolation is not some kind of figure. It's not some type of hideous, gross kind of entity, right? That's what's thought of. But really, when we actually try to understand what it means, the abomination of desolation is a movement of, I'll see in this context, it ends up being the Romans who come in and they occupy the Holy Land. That's what they do. Even if you go to Luke, Luke says what it actually is, that the enemies march in and they desecrate the temple, right? They desecrate the temple by taking down its anything, the holy things, if you will, right? And putting up their ensigns and pretty much marking it up for themselves. Basically, what was holy, they profaned it, they brought it down. So that's going to be the abomination of desolation. But listen to this. Now, this is the challenge back to the futurists. And in verse 16, Jesus says, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Okay, if we're talking about a world cosmic event, first of all, how can you flee anywhere? Okay, and then why is he just saying to those in Judea? Well, again, we want to stay in the context. He's talking to a specific people at a certain time. He says in verse 17, a man on the housetop must not come down to get things out of his house, and a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Again, where's there to run? If this is a global thing, a cosmic thing, there's nowhere to run. Not by any means. So why does he even tell him to do anything? Just say, hey, it's coming for you. There's nothing you can do about it. But he doesn't. He tells him there's actually somewhere of where to flee to, of where to run from. And he says, woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Again, why is he saying woe to them? Because obviously they're going to be carrying babies. And when this comes, whatever's coming to happen at the time, they got to be able to flee. Well, nursing mothers, they're vulnerable, right? They're vulnerable. If they're in the middle of labor and they've had a kid, they're in a very rough spot. So he says, woe to them, because it happens, they're not going to probably get out. They're not going to be able to flee from whatever is coming. And then he says, for at that time there will be great distress, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now and never will again. So we kind of see him reference three things. He says, one, that there will be a great distress, okay? And then he says, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world, okay, until now and never will again. So he says never will again. So obviously there's something after that that's not going to be as distressful. So there's a time window for this to happen. So that's where, again, stay with the context. Otherwise he would just say, I would think he would say, for at the time there will be great distress, and the kind hasn't happened from the beginning of the world until now, and he'll speak of an actual end, but he does. It says never will again. So there's time duration after this period he's talking about. Because in verse 2, unless those days were cut short, no one would be saved. But those days will be cut short for the sake of the elect. So, again, he's given this window of being able to flee, to be able to leave, but God has made a point to do what? To protect his people. Because one thing that's important is that during this time, the persecution was coming from Israel, from the religious leaders. That's where it's coming from. Not from any kind of outside government. It was coming from them. But this is where the Romans will come in, and ultimately they remove the Pax Romana, the time of peace, and then they start definitely persecuting Christians. So the Jews have been hitting them very hard, and you see it all through the book of Acts. Now Jesus talks about this greater persecution is going to come. It's going to be when the Romans come, they take down Jerusalem, which was an absolutely cataclysmic event. I mean, it absolutely was. He says here in verse 23, if anyone tells you then, see here is the Messiah, or over here, do not believe it. Now think about that. The futurists will say that he's going to physically return. But Jesus is saying, hey, if someone says, see, here's the Messiah over there, do not believe it. So we're not looking for any kind of visual coming then. So it's a different context. He's not talking about the bodily return of Christ. He's talking about a coming of the Lord, a presence of the Lord. Okay, that's you can't be deceived by a thing that's going to be actually him. You're not going to see a body. So don't look that way. Don't be fooled by that, right? That's not what's going to come. He says, for false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Now, we see that through the book of Acts, but we also know that there's false messiahs and prophets that come up throughout our generation, right? So that's not anything that's kind of, in a sense, specific or out of the ordinary. We see that happening, right? We see that happening. So he says, don't be fooled by them, because my words, right, are true. Don't be defeated, because otherwise, here's the thing. If they're saying to look for me again, you might be deceived by a false prophet who rises up. You might think that's him. No, don't look for me. Don't look for me, he says. I'm not there. I'm not there. Don't be deceived. Just take note. I have told you in advance. So if they tell you, see, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. Or see, he's in the storerooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. It's going to be a presence. Okay, a presence. Now, I will say this to be fair. There are preterist interpreters that understand that this will be the coming of the Son of Man actually is to a bodily return because of the use of the word parousia here. But we won't get into that for now. And in verse 28, he says, wherever the carcass is, there the vultures will gather. That is the result of a people being cursed by God. As their bodies are left there, on the ground, exposed, and the vultures come and feed on him. Now, there's also another interpretive insight here where the word vultures actually is the word eagle. Well, the Romans, their symbol was an eagle, and they put their eagles whatever they took over. So that's an idea of thinking that could be that. I'm either not really for it or not, but it works, I guess. All right, verse 29 says, immediately after the stress of those days. So he's talking about, again, the stress of these days that he's been speaking about all this time. He says, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not shed its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Now this here is where a lot of futurists jump ship. They stay pretty close to the context. They may have got through the verse 14 hurdle, but some have already kind of abandoned at that point. But they've made it this far. And they say, oh my goodness. Well, the moon is still there. The sun is still there. The stars are still there. So obviously this hasn't happened. Water break? Was it cool? Yeah, okay. Abandon ship. Well, we got to stay within the context. We got to say, okay, he is using language from the Old Testament. It's the interpretive reference that the New Testament authors utilize to share with Israel of that what we've seen in the past is happening now. It's going to be this kind of epic event that it's going to feel like the world is coming down, right? The collapse of this empire is coming down. So that's all they know. When that happens, that's going to feel like a world is coming down upon them. That basically everything is done. So he says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn. So that passage there really throws a lot of people off, because they say, oh, it's talking about him, the Son of Man, in the sky. Well, no. It says the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky. But what is that? I think a more kind of word-for-word reading says that the sign of the Son of Man, or the sign that the Son of Man, right, is at the right hand of the Father, is what's going to appear. Because the Son of Man language is all from Daniel, about him ascending to the right hand of the Father, the Son of Man. But I'll kind of keep reading, and then I'll come back to that. He says, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Again, there's that language of it looks like he says there's going to see this physical coming of Christ in the clouds. But again, we're still in that context. He just told them, if you look for the Messiah here, don't look. It's not going to be me. I'm not coming. There's not going to be a physical presence of me. But he says the sign of the Son of Man. Well, the sign of the Son of Man, that he's at the right hand of the Father, that we'd ultimately would draw our conclusions from, is that the sign is that Israel as a nation has been brought down. They rejected her king. The new king has been enthroned at the right hand of the Father, right? So the sign that he is there at the right hand is bringing down Israel, is to the destruction of Jerusalem, bringing down their entire Old Covenant system. He thrashed it. Instead of them seeing that the Old Covenant, everything they did pointed to him, they wanted to keep going with the Old Covenant, the law of Moses, and reject its true king. So he brings it down. So that is the sign when you see the smoke of Israel going up into the clouds, right? That's the sign that the Son of Man, right, is in the right hand of the Father. And it says, then all the peoples of the earth will mourn. Now again, if you go to your Bible, there should be a little probably superscript that has a letter that says A or B, and really it says in the Greek, all tribes of the land. So the translators have put earth. That's where I think they've kind of imported a futurist perspective by putting earth there, so they're actually saying the tribes of the land. This is a reference back to Zechariah, talking about those will see upon the one they have pierced, and they will mourn. So he's using that language. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Well, when Christ ascended to the right hand of the Father, it says he appeared to the Ancient of Days in the clouds, right, at his rightful place. And Daniel 7 talks about the Ancient of Days giving him a people, a nation that has dominion over, power over everything. So he was giving them this people, his people. And so the sign that he's actually at the right hand of the Father, having that power, is that he comes in the clouds with power and great glory. Again, that's Old Testament language to speak about God coming to destroy an enemy. He's using the same language, saying that this Messiah, he's the one that actually is in the clouds, has this great power. That's who God is. That's what we're learning about the Messiah, is that he is truly God of God. And then it says he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Now, angels here, we need to understand angels most often, well, let me phrase that. quite often, I don't want to be too strict, but quite often refers to just messengers that are humans, that are people. And so I would understand this passage to be angels understanding human messengers that are going out to declare the good news. The king is here. The king is at the right hand. That's the message. And so to bring God's people back that have been scattered among the nations. So they're being sent out to the four winds from the end of the sky to the other to herald that the king has come. The king has taken down Israel. The kingdom of God has now been fully inaugurated. Not complete, but now that's the new heaven that we have here on the earth. It's starting. It's one that God's creating. So then he says in verse 32, learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near. Again, he's giving them something to look at, to know that these things are going to happen. Here's the point. If this was going to be so much further from now, why even give these things for them to be able to look at so they can tell the signs of what's going to happen? Now, again, we could say that could be a fig tree 2,000 years from now. It could be just an example, which I can agree with that. That's fine. But my point is, he's telling them what to look for. But if it's truly the end, as what we know hasn't happened yet, Jesus says that nobody knows the hour or the day when that will happen, right? Nobody knows, so be ready. But here he's giving signs. Then he says here, verse 33, in the same way, when you see all these things, he's talking to his disciples. When you see all these things, recognize that he is near, at the door. At the door. If that's 2,000 plus years from now, that's a long hallway to get to the door, right? It's a long entryway. But he's saying, if you see these things, he told them all these things to look for, which they did see and happen, the end is near, right? He is near. But again, the future is going to say, oh, that must be much later on. Because why? The stars have not come crashing down upon the earth. The sky, or the sun is giving its light. The moon hasn't turned to blood, right? All this kind of language hasn't happened, so the end isn't here. They'd say, well, this near at the door must actually mean near, but in a later context, so that when he actually is near, it will then be near them. But again, that doesn't take his words for what they say. Because if he's truly going to be near, and he meant it, how else could he say it more than he's saying it right here? And this is where he said, this is the last verse of this section where I believe the Olivet Discourse kind of comes to a close. It has these bookends before it moves into discourse that talks about the true second coming. And he says here, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So as you can see, we have these bookends. So verse 34 talks about this generation will not pass away until all these things take place that he's talked about. In the first bookend, on the left, I will say to my left, right, is when he says to them, truly I tell you, all these things will come on this generation. And that's in verse 36 of chapter 23. So that's kind of the first bookend. And then verse 34 in Matthew 24 is the outer bookend, closing all this one event that's going to come to fruition by AD 70. And that's where, that's where we differ from a preterist to a futurist. And then from verse 36 on, this is where Jesus says, now concerning that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, except the Father alone. And then he goes in this language about basically being ready. He gives the example about as the days of Noah were, so the coming of the Son of Man will be. For in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah boarded the ark. They didn't know until the flood came and swept them all away. But think about this. He's just given us all these signs to look for, that it says once this happens, he's going to be, that means he's at the door. He's right there. Then he moves to saying, they didn't even know what happened. What hit them? That's where, again, I believe this transition takes place through the rest of the Olivet Discourse that talks about the second coming, right? Because then at the end of the Olivet Discourse, he talks about separating the sheep and the goats, that judgment language of the great white throne judgment. So I think it's good for now. Again, my book really fleshes that out in more detail, the verses we just went through. You can find the majority of what Jesus talks about here actually take place in the book of Acts. You can. So I think the Bible supplies our answer. Of course, Josephus is a great historical document for us, and a few others that help us kind of paint this picture of the destruction of Jerusalem. And but we don't obviously look at Josephus as being inspired, but like any other Bible scholar, or any interpreter, we utilize external sources to help us understand historical context. So it's not wrong to do that. People do it all the time. I say that because I've heard somebody say that he rejects a preterist perspective because of having to rely on Josephus. Well, if that's the case, we can't use any like First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, Ezra, all those books that are in the intertestamental time to give us a historical background of what's happening to Israel, which they utilize all the time. So, all right, I think that's it. I'm good.